Speaking of counties, what is happening in
I'm
Fulton
not
County?
doing anything, but the FBI went in because it's been under I guess, review for years. The cheating that took place in Fulton County and in that particular
Nobody knows what's in the warrant.
What you're going to find out. Look, why would anybody be upset that they went in and they got the ballots, I guess, right? Again, they did this. That's been under review and under investigation for 4 years. And now they got a court order. You know, they got a court order signed by
nobody knows what
a respected but liberal judge, signed a court order allowing them to go and pick them up. Well, you're going to know what the ballots say because they're right now inspecting the ballot. I'm not involved in it, but they are inspecting and checking the ballot.
Why is Tulsi Gabbard there?
I don't know, but you know...
Welcome back to Posting Through It. I'm Jared.
And I'm Mike. So to start off, we have Patreon shout-outs. We got Russell Craig, Liz Murray. Anybody else I'm missing, Jared?
I think that's what we've got in the Platinum tier, which gets a shout-out. But for everyone else, you can go to our Patreon. $5 a month. You get access to weekly bonus episodes, including the last one where we talked all about the Turning Point USA alternative halftime show. There may have been some country music renditions that occurred in that episode, but you'll have to go there to check it out. We've got some more listener music to feature this week, but I forgot to shout out on the mic what we used during last week's Steven Crowder episode. That was a track called Snow by Triage. So thanks to Chris for sending that one to us. There's a link to that track in the description of that episode, but I also wanted to make sure I said it on the mic. This week, we've got transition music courtesy of another listener. Chris Mason listens to Posting Through It, but he's also the lyricist in a band called Faulty Cognitions out of San Antonio, Texas. He shared their sophomore album, described their sound to me as, quote, jangly anti-fascist melodic punk. The album's called They Promised Us Heaven, and I was really into it. This episode's transition music comes from the 5th track on that record. It's called Don't Let Them See You Suffer. There's a link to their Bandcamp page in the episode description.
So last month, on January 28th, the FBI conducted a raid on an elections office in Fulton County, Georgia. It's near Atlanta. They seized more than 700 boxes of ballots and other election materials. On site when it happened, there was a face that seemed to surprise a lot of people. That's Tulsi Gabbard. She once represented Hawaii in the House of Representatives as a Democrat before pivoting to becoming a MAGA movement supporter and celebrity, I should say, and a leading role as Trump's Director of National Intelligence. News of the raid triggered an alarm in a lot of people, including ourselves, who are feeling a little nervous about what the Trump administration might do when it comes to undermining the vote in the 2026 midterms and the 2028 general election.
People will likely remember that in 2020, Trump and his political allies focused heavily on trying to undermine the vote in Georgia, where Trump lost to Joe Biden by about 12,000 votes. Trump famously called Georgia's Secretary of State that year and pressured him to, quote, find enough votes for him to win the state. He was charged with that in 2023, but the prosecution of that case was really messy, and it got even messier after Trump won. The case was dropped in its entirety late last year. Georgia has been at the epicenter of all kinds of legal efforts, partisan media propaganda, and straight-up conspiracy theories attacking the legitimacy of voting in the southern state, with the goal of finding some kind of story arc from 2020 and after where Trump actually won the state.
Well, Jared, it's important to emphasize here at this point that Fulton County, according to 2020 census results, is majority non-white. So that is a pretty big data point. About 45% of the people who live there are black, compared to about 44% who are white. It also has the highest population of any county in Georgia. We've historically seen election denialists fixate on places where large minority and immigrant populations exist, like in Detroit and Philadelphia. And this goes back, of course, to the 2016 campaign and Roger Stone, when the first Stop the Steal campaign really took off.
So since Trump took office for his second term, we've seen the administration devote a lot of resources and energy toward tracing down the boogeymen that have haunted them for the last decade. They're supposedly investigating Antifa. They're manifesting their most craven wet dreams about brutalizing immigrants. And now, it seems they're also revisiting the 2020 election again in hopes that maybe this time they'll find some sort of smoking gun.
So if news of this raid in Georgia set off the alarm bells in your head, you are not alone. It comes at a time when Trump has openly mused about wanting to, quote, nationalize elections, eliminating mail-in voting, and ordering ICE agents to surround the polls. Today, we're going to look back on what we've learned about that raid since it happened, and try to explain what exactly is happening in general with this threat to democracy. This is particularly important ahead of this year's midterms.
Today, we're joined by Hunter Walker. He's an investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo who's been following this story closely. Aside from Talking Points Memo, you may have read his stories in publications like The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, New York Magazine, among others. We'll put some links to some of his stories about this raid in Georgia in the description of this episode. And with that, Hunter, what's up, man? Thanks for taking some time and joining Posting Through It this week.
You know, I know this may air later, but let me just say happy Friday the 13th to you all, as if it couldn't get any weirder.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even realize it was Friday the 13th, but that makes sense, yeah.
It's always Friday the 13th now, Mike.
Yeah, Valentine's Day, which is also an underrated, subject matter for horror movies, by the way.
So I guess first off, just how are you doing, Hunter? I mean, you've been following politics real close. I mean, you used to be a White House correspondent and everything. You've been with us staring into the void for a while. Also, do you listen to techno? That's an important question for this podcast.
So, I'm doing good, man. I'm coming to you live from Ice Planet Brooklyn. That's really been quite a demoralizing slog. And, I do think that, as the news and the political environment is so intense, the entire city freezing over for a month with black sludge snow was sort of insult to injury. But, I'm doing good. And as far as music, it's interesting because I have found in the past couple of years, and I really do feel like it's sort of influenced by how crazy things are. I'm just listening to stuff that's more out there than ever. So I feel like if you asked me that question a couple of years ago, I was sort of a very hip hop and classic rock and reggae purist. But I'm trying to listen to the weirdest electronic and metal and punk I can find these days. I don't know. I'm actually not well versed in any of it enough to know what counts as techno. But I'm plugged in, man.
I don't want to take this whole thing off the rails, so I'm not going to really get into it. All I'll say is that you get, as a guest, get free access to our premium, and we do album recs at the end of every one. So when it comes to obscure techno, that's usually my problem to handle.
Well, I'll throw a couple in there. The things that are on repeat for me endlessly right now. I'm really trying to support indie artists on Bandcamp, and I'm really into techno cumbia, if you will. One of my big favorites is Amantes del Futuro. People should definitely listen to those albums. And also there's this group I found right now called Mokotron, and they are Maori bass guys. So it's coming out of New Zealand, and it's really hardcore bass with dope tribal influences. I'm digging that quite a bit.
I like that idea.
So Hunter, what were your just kind of first thoughts when you saw the news about this raid in Fulton County? Because I know when I saw it, it took me a minute to process it, of just because I've heard people in the election denialist space fantasizing about doing this kind of shit for so long. And there it is. It's happening. And Tulsi Gabbard is there for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, I would say my reaction was exactly what you just said. Like, not to speak in millennial, but y'all know the Ron Paul gif, right? It's happening, right? Like they have been telling us they are going to do something like this for, as I think you guys were alluding to earlier, really, really 10 years now. I think people forget that Stop the Steal actually is something that began with Roger Stone in 2015. Okay, he set up the website for it. He was preparing this strategy in the event Trump lost, right, in that golden escalator era, right? And they ultimately mothballed it because they didn't lose in 2016. And part of the whole thing is to not complain about the elections where they lose. That's where they really start to give up the game a little bit. But this movement to essentially fight any Trump or Republican loss is a decade old now, and it's only been growing. And what we've seen in this current iteration of it is that through the last presidential campaign and into the Trump administration, they really got an official arm to the election denialism movement, with people specifically in Georgia taking over state election boards. And now, of course, with, the conspiracy theorists, the call moving inside the White House, if you will, with these folks taking power in government. So, I don't want to say I fully predicted this because it was very outlandish and excessive. But I personally have been covering this movement in all its many facets for a while, and I've been expecting attacks on our elections.
This whole back and forth that is going on since the very beginnings of Trump's political career, which has been like sort of like where people are like, this looks like fascism. This is fascism. And then people will be like, no. That's not what it is. And then, you got to use the right terms, and you got to, you have to like back it. And then they'll be like, oh, I'm going to do this thing. And then you'll be like, oh my God, this is an authoritarian takeover. And then it'll be, you're stop screeching. This is so hyperbolic. Then the Trump administration will do the thing, right? Like quite literally in front of you. Mm-hmm. Right. And it feels like it's just been that going further and further until this moment that we're in now, where they do actually have a considerable amount of power over elections, partly because of changeover that existed from the first time they were in power, and also just radicalization of Republican officials, right, who have just sort of been in this shit, ingesting this stuff for a while. If you could give us some background on Georgia. Why did this become the epicenter? Because like for me, like just not digging into it as deeply as you, for me, I think it was just they were so pissed off and so shocked that Biden won in 2020. And I remember the other side of that where people were sharing these memes of like, like leftists were sharing these memes of like Pepe the Frog over the Georgia thing, except it's blue, like doing the chin stroking thing, like, oh, looks like you didn't count on this type thing. Was it just shock, or is there something else?
There's a lot to unpack there. And I actually, before we get into Georgia and how it has been a focus of the election denialism, Stop the Steal movement, I want to really hone in on something you said there, because I think it's really important. You were essentially touching on this, I would say, almost institutional, conventional wisdom disbelief around Trump. Right? Where he says what he's going to do, he does the thing, and very smart, powerful people in politics and media sort of continually are surprised by it, right? And I would go back to 2015. I talked to Trump a lot during that campaign, and one of the moments where I spoke to him, I went up to the Trump Tower and interviewed him, and it was clear to me what he was signaling towards, right? And so I focused in on immigration and focused in on treatment of minorities. At the time, I sort of looked at Muslims. I mean, I think Latinos have obviously become the main target of the president's ire. But I said, would you consider registering people or putting them in a database? And he said, absolutely. he said we have to go beyond databases. And I printed this, and it was a firestorm. And it was a firestorm in part because what he said sounded extreme. We were clearly talking about sort of ethnic detention and profiling, right? But it was also a firestorm because people were like, oh, did he really say that? To the point that, like, Rush Limbaugh did a whole segment saying that I made the thing up. Rachel Maddow had to put my audio on air because, yeah, he actually said it, right? And then ultimately, he did indeed go, as he said, beyond databases. In term one, we saw the Muslim ban, which was, a very specific list of Muslim countries. His ICE policies at this point have gone so far beyond registries and databases. I mean, we're deep into facial recognition and mass camp infrastructure, right? So, Trump has continually said what he is going to do. And that included all of these efforts to target the elections. Back in 2015-16, he was not committing to accepting a loss. Again, we didn't have to see what Stop the Steal would have looked like in early 2017, but we did see it 4 years later. And he, said, we're going to fight. And then he sent those people to fight. I was standing there as it happened. And personally, I'm very adamant right now, and I do try to be, TPM is obviously a progressive site, but I try to really take an objective focus, in part because I feel like a lot of people are having a problem being objective right now. And what I mean is, fascism, authoritarianism, these are technical academic terms, and that's what we're dealing with now. Right. And one of the characteristics of that is a lack of free and fair elections or efforts by the leader to challenge those. So I think that's really important. And I'm sorry to sort of begin with a tangent, but I think that's the context we're operating in.
Yeah, I often say this sometimes to my peers and colleagues when they pick up a story and things like that. I always say, like, whatever it is. I mean, I understand that Substacks. We've all been, a lot of people are kind of siloed into opinion writing with journalism because of the nature of what's happened to our field. But I said, when in doubt, do it the old way, right? Yeah. Do it the old way with the three sides and everything else, right? To do it, because it will ultimately hit them a lot harder, and it's a lot. You're skimming a lot closer to the truth that way. Yeah, and the truth is a lot where it hits a lot harder, I think, than just saying, like, pointing and saying fascist.
We're also operating in a world where I know you guys have delved very deeply into this, where folks like Barry Weiss are saying, I'm the only honest, objective one, while obviously peddling ideology.
Honestly, is her podcast,
right? Like literally declaring herself as the only quote unquote free press, right? While she's basically very much, having a clear bias. And those are the people who would say it's unacceptable to call this authoritarian. And I just will not play that game. One thing that I love about being at Talking Points Memo is I think Josh Marshall and our site has for years been early in covering the radicalization of the GOP. Because this didn't just begin with Trump. He was operating in an ecosystem, where there were militias, there was racism that was like really allowed to take root. And he's just taken advantage of these existing structures. So the bottom line is, what we are seeing is an authoritarian push to keep the party in power. That's what this is. And it is focused intently on Georgia, but I think I want to be clear that it's not just about Georgia. This is very much sort of the Steve Bannon throw shit at the wall type model, right? And essentially, I think I began this by saying we've been living in Stop the Steal for 10 years now. And what Stop the Steal has been is a movement with propaganda components, media arm, a paramilitary component, your groups like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, have been involved in this. Now there's always been a political arm. With the 147 Republicans who tried to overturn the 2020 election, and now you're seeing this sort of official arm that they have the reins of government once again, and they've always had these multiple units kind of working multiple strategies at once, just to see what would work. with January 6th. We saw the alternate electors going at the same time. We saw the crowd going into the Capitol. We saw the 147 Republicans on the House floor. So Georgia's just one component of this, but it's always been a really key one. And I think part of that is because they have people in the legislature and in the election boards who are willing to work with them. And another part of that is there's a little bit of a psychological thing there where, of course, Georgia was the final call in 2021. So that's always sort of stuck in Donald Trump's craw.
Let's take a closer look at this raid in Fulton County specifically as a way of understanding maybe sort of the bigger picture. You've done some reporting about how this raid came into existence to begin with. One of the stories you have at Talking Points Memo points to a report that a group called the Oversight Group put out on January 6th this year. Great choice of date. Tell us about that group and what was up with that report.
Yeah, so essentially this report came out, and you had the raid on Fulton County about 3 weeks later, and the title of this report was Fulton County Report of Investigation of the 2020 General Election. And what you have is a 263-page document that largely just rehashed various debunked, irrelevant allegations about how the vote was collected in Fulton County. But yet this group, the report clearly preceded the raid, and this group was referenced in the FBI affidavit that was used to obtain the search warrant. So it was clearly influential. And what I would say before we even dig more into what happened in Fulton County, election oversight group, two key executives in it are these guys, David Cross and Kevin Moncla. I think Moncla is largely being credited as the key author of this report. But they previously worked on this document that Trump allies were calling the nuclear doc that Trump's legal team brought up, where they were trying to sort of make their beefs about Georgia part of his defense in the indictment against him in that state. So their work has clearly reached Trump's desk. It has been used by his team. Another key figure in that was Liz Harrington. She was the spokeswoman for his campaign in 2024, who, even the major papers were reporting was a controversial figure in his orbit for kind of bringing these conspiracies onto his desk. And we've seen a social media feedback loop, including just before this raid, where Trump was on Truth Social blasting out Harrington, referring to stuff from this report, which wasn't even public at the time. So it's really clear that this report made its way to Trump's team, and it ultimately basically turned into a search warrant. And Moncla has admitted, he wouldn't talk to me, he's not responded to any of my requests for comment, but he did admit that he has communicated with, he said, a U.S. attorney prior to the raid happening. So you have this group of election denialists who were directly influencing and almost directing the FBI in this matter.
Yeah, the affidavit for the raid was unsealed last week, and it had, like you said, a bunch of claims in it that, including a lot that had been investigated, and law enforcement was like, well, nothing there, and kind of left it alone, right? It truly is just like a rehash. It's like now that's what I call the election was fake album, volume, whatever we're on now. They seem to hand most of the credit to this guy named Kurt Olson, who's identified in the affidavit as the presidentially appointed Director of Election Security and Integrity. What can you tell us about this guy? Because he's kind of a character, right?
So Kurt Olson is now identified as a special government employee. That's the same designation that Elon Musk had. And it allows you to work in the executive branch for, I think it's 130 days. I think his term has concluded, but he's the one who clearly made the referral for the Fulton County raid. And Kurt Olson is an attorney who's been a longtime figure in this Stop the Steal election denial universe. He represented Kari Lake, the candidate in Arizona, as she sought to challenge her own losses in that state. It was a total failure. I mean, I think one thing to mention is that all of these allegations, whether it be Kari Lake's, whether it be Trump's, they have been so thoroughly litigated, and their record of losses is, I think, nearly 100%. So he's been in this universe, and so has the election oversight group. I mean, there's a byline, in addition to Kevin Moncla and David Cross, folks like Joseph Rossi, Garland Favorito. These people have been working together for a long time. And if you, as I know you guys always do, kind of dive into the social media pages and what have you, these guys are all on streams together with folks like Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, and David Clements. I mean, there's various organizations and crowdfunding campaigns backing their work. So I think Kurt Olson is one of two examples we have in this report of someone who has kind of come out of that web of grassroots organizations and legal disputes and has now actually been brought into the government. And we are seeing whatever shadowy work product he's producing turn into FBI law enforcement action.
You also did some reporting on a guy named Clay Parikh. Is that how you say it? I don't think many of our listeners will know that name. I know I certainly didn't. But you actually spoke to him. I love your story where he's like, I have no comment on the matter, and then proceeds to talk to you for 2 hours.
People need to read Hunter's reporting for multiple reasons. He's a pro for one reason. Another thing is he's introducing characters now that you'll be talking about in like a year. So it's like, remember when the Kraken was like, everybody's talking about the Kraken? You can get introduced to some of these type of characters before they become memes.
Yeah.
So this guy Clay, what's his role in this, and what can you tell us about him?
Sky Clay, man, he's a guy. Also, let's start there. He is a very specific type of guy, and he is the second person who was identified in this affidavit as a special government employee in the executive branch. And I should say I've reached out to the White House to ask about that. As of right now, they have not responded at all to tell me about Clay Parikh or his work. But what we see in the affidavit is that basically someone from the election oversight group, an unnamed witness, it certainly sounds a lot like Kevin Moncla, it's someone who helped author this report, asked Clay Parikh to look at what they call the tabulator images, which are a really big fixation for the Fulton County denialists. And Clay Parikh looked at them and he was disturbed, and he relayed those concerns to the FBI, and that was part of what inspired this raid. And before we dig into Clay Parikh, and that's going to take a second, let me just preface this whole discussion with the report and the allegations around Fulton County with like just a couple of key details, because we don't need to get bogged down in it because this stuff has been litigated, it has been debunked. But essentially, what you've had happen in Georgia is because Trump and his allies have been fixated on it. You've seen multiple recounts and audits. The result has been affirmed by members of Trump's own party. If anything, he's gained votes when they looked at it very closely. But because of the level of scrutiny, there have been at points a couple of small errors with the process that were found, which, frankly, I think if most statewide elections were subjected to 3 recounts and an audit, like you'd probably find a fuck up or two, right? So for example, like one incident where, 3,000 ballots were counted twice. And by the way, we know that because they caught it, right? And they addressed that. These ballot images that the denialists are fixated on, it seems like at points, some of the ballot images, so basically a ballot is submitted, it is theoretically, there's a visual copy made of it. It seems like for some of them, they either didn't make a visual copy or accidentally made a visual copy of 2, right? These tabulators, these are tabulator images. These are records of individual counts on individual machines. So these are the fixations of these groups. What I love about the FBI affidavit is that even as they say, we found evidence of possible criminal activity to the point that we're going to raid the county election hub and take 600 plus boxes of voting records and just seize this stuff. Even as they say all this, the affidavit includes all of the probably innocuous explanations for the various obsessions of the election denialists without litigating this and going down the rabbit hole with them very broadly. They're worried about intermediary steps in the process without being worried about the final count. And one of my favorite lines in the affidavit is actually related to Clay Parik's fixation with these tabulator images, and an unnamed witness who has been involved in investigating this stuff said the tabulator tapes from the, I'm quoting now, the tabulator tapes from the original count are not compared to the reports from the recount. Witness 6 stated that the ballots are what mattered. So again, the actual votes and the proper counting of those votes is all that mattered, not an individual record on a machine or some image someone may have copied wrong at one point. Was the count okay? And continually every investigator and state official has said yes, right? So anyway, you've got Clay Parik. He's a special government employee. He's obsessed with the ballot images. And he comes out of also the Stop the Steal election denial universe. He had actually appeared as a quote unquote expert witness for Carrie Lake in that trial where Kurt Olson was representing her. So he's an associate of all these people. He's been, at events with Mike Lindell and David Clements, this other guy coming out of New Mexico who's a thoroughly debunked conspiracy theorist. But what's interesting about Clay is, he purports to be a Marine veteran, a former defense contractor, and just like a real cybersecurity expert. So I called him to get a flavor of his concerns and expertise. And as you were saying before, Jared, he begins the call by saying, I'm not going to comment on anything. He confirmed he was a special government employee in the executive branch, but he said he couldn't talk about it. He couldn't talk about if his work got to the president. And, he wasn't going to comment because he doesn't like the media.
No, hold on a second. Was it that he is, I don't want to say too stupid or just too ignorant to understand that I don't want to comment was not an agreement to go off the record? Is that like, is it just, I don't want to comment and now I'm going to keep talking? Because that's what it sounds like. It sounds like he was like thinking he was coming to an agreement to go off the record, but said the wrong thing.
No. We did not go off record at any point in this conversation. It wasn't even close to that.
This is the ideal. This is the ideal guy to interview. Continue.
No, it was absolutely a reporter's dream because he said, I'm not going to comment. And then he proceeded to hold forth for 2 hours, literally almost 2 hours, going up until almost midnight New York time the other night. I'm still kind of fried this week over it.
So good.
Yeah, I spent a long, dark night of the soul with Clay Parik. And he didn't want to comment about, specifically what might come next, what his work is that he's doing in the White House, but he did want to comment on everything else, including, his belief that there may be poisons in the food supply in sodas, that there's a quote-unquote cabal of quote-unquote pure evil that may be running things in the world. That evil includes quote-unquote gay pride. He suggested at one point that it might be demonic in nature. He claimed that during his military career, he had been experimented on. I mean, this was the conspiracy.
Hold on, I gotta correct your passive voice here. Had been Who experimented on him? Who is the person who did the experimenting? That's the part I want to know. Who experimented on him?
Well, so this is the amazing thing, and I kept trying to push him on this, right? But here you have a guy who is a special government employee in the executive branch, right? Working on an investigation, and we haven't even touched on this, but the entire election inquiry is being directed by Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, the president's top spy master, and FBI Director Kash Patel.
A regular fixture on this show, by the way, Kash.
So
I don't know if you've seen it. I feel like we should have this handy, Jared, just to play the audio for everybody. But when he was interviewed with Katie Miller, he did a thing with Katie Miller, Stephen Miller's wife.
We love the Katie Miller podcast.
Yeah, they're big fans of it. And he, proceeded to talk about his Uber Eats orders at length. And then he was saying that they asked him what he likes to do. And he's like, I don't like to do anything, man. And then he proceeded to talk about his favorite shows on Paramount Plus and how he's watching Landman. And it's just really, it's very weird because it almost feels like he does nothing. But yet he's somehow tagged in everything that happens.
I mean, not to go off on a tangent here, but I love Katie Miller's podcast. It is some of the most unintentionally funny.
It
Absolutely
is
is.
so haunting, man. It just like stays with you.
The self-awareness
Yes.
is not strong with that one.
No.
But so you've got Clay Parikh, and he's literally working for the White House and some of the government's top spies. These are normally the people that, your traditional X-Files era conspiracy theorists were fixated on, right? And yet Clay Parikh is alleging there's a conspiracy inside the government. It's like, bro, you're inside the government. The call's coming from inside the White House. He really didn't seem able to grapple with it. He kept saying there was a deep state. And it's like, then why are you working for the administration? Right?
That's you, bro. That's you.
Yeah. And what he basically framed it, despite literally working for the president and the director of the FBI and what have you, as, this small group of people fighting against this pure evil cabal. And he cited the oligarchs. And at one point I was like, I asked him because I think the first quote unquote special government employee we all met in this brave new world we're living in was Elon Musk. Right. And I'm like, well, if you're worried about oligarchs, like, what about Elon? Right. And he just said, that it was like somehow a powerful signal to have Elon take a role in the administration. He didn't really elaborate on that. And I will say that, one feature of talking to Clay Parikh was that as much as he went off for 2 hours, I didn't get a word in edgewise. This was virtually listening to a paranoid monologue.
And I also just want to go back to the fact that presumably he's in DC. This is, 10 p.m. to midnight. You're getting the night shift from this guy. He's presumably he's just like chilling at his house and just letting it rip.
I believe he may have been in Alabama. So we'll give him an hour. This was probably more up to 11 p.m. his time. But yeah, it was a late night phone call. And I have to tell you, and typically as a reporter, I mean, again, I said this is a reporter's dream, right? When you have someone inside the executive branch just like letting loose inside your phone, you don't want to stop them, except that with Clay, it got so incoherent and I was honestly tired that by the end of this call, I was able to get him off the phone. And it came after I tried to say goodbye about 5 or 6 times because the substance, as it were, of our call, had long since passed. And again, I wasn't getting answers to these fundamental questions about what kind of work he's doing now. And also, these tensions about being against the deep state while working for the state. He just was not giving a coherent answer on that. But I do think it was revelatory in a sense of showing the Christian nationalism and extreme conspiracy theory ideology that has now, under Trump, been brought inside the government, literally, and that is through figures like Kurt Olson and Clay Parikh and the Election Oversight Group, now directing law enforcement actions and directing the stop the steal assault on our election infrastructure.
I just want to ask this question, and I don't know if this is out of order, Jared, but it fits sequentially for me here. So we've got this rogues gallery of brain poison freaks. I am not that's not your reporting. That's my personal opinion. If just to keep you objective. They talk about Trump derangement syndrome, right? Like they're like, oh, this person's got Trump derangement. I mean, the people who have Trump derangement syndrome are these motherfuckers, quite frankly. Excuse part of my French. Their brains are cooked on this material. You have that. You had mentioned previously that they had their own paramilitary stuff with the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. That's been institutionalized. A lot of those people, a lot of the people who would be joining those groups are now in groups like ICE and CPB, right? Or CBP.
CPB is dead. That's the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that has now been eliminated.
That's right. Okay. Excuse me.
There is no more CPB.
The point is that they have a tremendous amount of power. They have a lot of money. They have now an institutionalized paramilitary. And I think I feel very comfortable calling ICE a paramilitary organization. I don't think I don't think that's off base. Okay. As opposed to my other nicknames here. You got these guys, their brains are cooked. They have these resources that I just described. How concerned should we be that they can overturn, this this still young project of American democracy.
Mhm.
You know, when Democrats are always like, we need to save the democracy. I'm like, no, that's the wrong thing, because democracy is always flawed. We need to make it better. We need to, make this more democratic than it is. So look at how screwed up our system really is, actually. But are they able to? Are they able to stifle this democracy in the crib? This particular group, because it does seem like a bunch of fools are involved here. I know Tulsi from back at her Modi support and all that stuff. She's got a lot. I mean, she's, I've seen her workout regimen. She's a very serious person in that regard. But this is not the best. These are not the best of the brightest America has to offer trying to do this. Are they capable of doing it? I mean, are we really at a place where we're so weak that this crew can actually put democracy to death in this country? I don't know how to look at. I don't know. We need to take it seriously. I'm certainly worried about it, but it also, on the other hand, it just seems like a gallery of fools here.
I'm so glad you asked me that question. I'm so glad you framed it exactly as you did. I think, what we're dealing with, and it's kind of hard to process this because it's almost two contradictory impulses. It's ridiculous and incredibly serious at the same time. When this guy is on the phone with me saying he thinks soda might be poison, so he always sanitizes it with alcohol.
I'm sorry.
That's absurd. It's absurd.
In my house, that's called a Jack and Coke.
Yeah, maybe some Jack Daniels. That's what it sounds like to me.
It's absurd, but it's incredibly serious when it's coming from a special government employee whose words are being used to send armed men into an election hub where they are stealing people's ballots with their private information on them, and somehow incorporating that into an effort to challenge elections. Right, Tulsi Gabbard, as you were saying, I've done a lot of reporting at TPM how she has these ties to an alleged religious cult in Hawaii. She's an extremely, let's say, unique individual.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Theoretically, she has no mandate as the director of national intelligence to be involved in domestic elections in this manner, but here she is. And this is really happening. Right. And it's like Donald Trump, and I think it's a big part of how his rise happened. I mean, he was basically doing like Don Rickles stand-up comedy with the 2016 GOP field during the primary. And it was ridiculous and funny until all of a sudden, police officers were having, what they've described as medieval style fighting on the steps of the Capitol, and our literally, most sacred institutions were being smashed and broken into. So this is really, really serious. And I think, societally, we're sort of still grappling with that, right? There was this whole strain of discourse on Blue Sky, and it really started around this Reuters interview that Trump did, where he's like, well, maybe we shouldn't even have elections at all. Right. And a lot of very knowing, very important conventional wisdom types, very quickly said, well, good thing the president doesn't control elections, which are run by the states. And, he can't do that.
Dude, it's the all-time banger tweet of like the Democrats saying, dogs can't play basketball. That's against the rules. While like AirPod does a backflip dunk behind them.
Right now, the golden retriever of authoritarianism is just, dunking in our faces, right? And some people are unable to call it that. And, they would still like to pretend the rules are holding harder than they are. I think one of the best examples of this is what's going on with the shutdown in ICE, where Democrats are trying to sort of slap ICE on the wrist and quote unquote reform it. And one of their quote unquote reform demands is for ICE not to seize people without a judicial warrant. Well, guess what? That's already the law, right? So we are struggling to enforce the rules, right? We're struggling to enforce things like, hey, the director of national intelligence shouldn't be conducting a raid.
The same thing is true, of course, of the filmed executions of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, which the issue is like, can we get an investigation into this? It's like they're anybody who is shot on tape, what they did beforehand. There's an investigation into it, and what is being normalized with that, as you know, piggyback off what you're saying, is this nonsense about like, oh well, maybe if we're lucky, we can get an investigation into it, as if that's something that would be a win. You know, I mean, that's that is the ground zero of the way our society is supposed to function.
And you know, when it comes to this election challenge, you know, and when I say election challenge, I mean this really major challenge to our free and fair election process. When it comes to that, you're seeing people say, basically, don't worry about it. Trump doesn't have magic powers. And, you know, calling anyone who has real concerns about this a quote unquote doomer. Right. And I'm actually glad to do this in the podcast format because like people can hear me like, you know, I'm going out to a lovely dinner with my wife tomorrow. I'm listening to Maori drum and bass and techno cumbia. Like I'm having fun in my life, but I'm also really freaked out about, you know, where we're headed societally. And I think we are deep down the road of authoritarianism. And I see people covering the 2026 midterms and the 2028 campaign as though it's going to be a conventional race. And it's like, no, it is already not conventional. The boxes have been seized in Fulton County. And I think to put a bow on the whole thing here, what I will say is that basically what Fulton County shows us is that the most extreme conspiracy-minded people have now gotten inside of the government. They are being empowered by Trump, who has been fostering and asking for this movement for 10 years now. They are trying multiple things at once. You know, I think it's important to mention that while Minneapolis was sort of being held hostage by the armed ICE occupation, Pam Bondi was demanding their voter rolls, right? So that gets back to what I was saying earlier. It's not just Georgia. Right. As this is going on, Trump's saying, as you said earlier, Mike, he wants to nationalize elections. He said to Reuters he doesn't want to have elections at all. Steve Bannon is saying maybe we'll have ICE at the polls. You know, there was this incredible exchange in the Senate where Democrats were asking one of the administrators about this, and he was like, "No, we're not going to have ICE at the polls." And the Democrat was like, "Well, I sure hope not." You know, and it's like we're really deep down this road. And, you know, it's not just ICE. It's not just the National Guard getting called into the cities. You know, we're seeing Trump, you know, such as the situation with Mark Kelly, such as ICE going into Minnesota, where Tim Walz was governor, such as ICE going into Illinois, where Pritzker's governor. We're seeing Trump target his potential 28 rivals. We're seeing them take hold of state election boards. So in Georgia, one of the things that's scary now is if there is some kind of criminal complaint cooked up with this half-baked evidence, the Republican legislature has ensured there's enough MAGA allies, including this lapsed obstetrician, on the board there, where potentially they could take over election administration in 4 different counties, right? And I think all of the dismissiveness about this misses what Trump has done, misses what he's saying he wants to do, which includes running for a 3rd term, by the way, right? And also misses the boat in that, you know, we don't need elections to turn off like a light switch for it to be a problem. That's probably something Trump can't do. But can he make it crazy or make it hard to certify the results in a key swing state or swing district or swing county? Yes. Could that create constitutional crisis and chaos? Yes. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to address that reality because, again, he's saying he wants to do it and he's well down the road.
And also just the threat of putting people at the polls, which didn't just come from Steve Bannon. I know there was this debate about whether it should be take it seriously. Steve Bannon says all kinds of things. I think Steve Bannon is actually pretty well clued into like what's going on.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, he absolutely said it as a flex, right? To try to like, he knows he can get a little bit of juice out of a comment like that. But I think he also knows there's some truth behind it. And it's something, quite frankly, they've been talking about in different ways for a long time. That goes back to 2020 when they were like, well, should we, I mean, things are so crazy with Black Lives Matter. Should we put people at the polls, you know, et cetera? I don't think people are prepared for what, you know, that kind of fear tactic, you know, psychologically, what that might be if all of a sudden there's a close race in whatever, it doesn't matter which state because it's midterms, and then all of a sudden there's just like a swarm of ICE agents, around that area under the, oh, well, we don't know, we might have a illegal, using their term, illegal immigrant, right, or something. They're looking for one. Who's going to try to vote, and in reality, what you're going to get is people are going to make a mental connection with, hey, they've shot multiple people, they've shot white people, they've shot, anybody could be scared of that image and seeing that image on the news.
Yeah, I'm also glad you said what you did about the election board in Georgia, because this is the same story across so many states, including some pretty key ones. Like in Michigan, Republicans hold the House. They have an election committee that's headed up by a woman who to this day thinks that the election was stolen in Michigan. She's like a former clerk. The election denialist movement got a lot of attention after the 2020 election, of course, and around the 2024 election. Of course, people were watching that. But this movement has really been making a lot of headway and getting their people into positions of authority where they can act on these theories. They've spent years harassing election officials. There's been an unprecedented purge of people quitting, being like, I'm not making, $50,000 a year, whatever it may be, to like get death threats all the time. And they filled it up with people who have their brains cooked. So I think what you said is right. It doesn't look like a light switch going on and off. It just looks like a bunch of tears happen. It's like a spider web crack on your windshield, like once a pebble hits. But I have a question for you, just to play devil's advocate here. Do you think it could be accurate to say that Tulsi Gabbard is jester maxing on the foids? And follow up to that, do you think there's any risk of Tulsi getting brutally frame-mogged by a Democrat maxing Giga Chad, or might her own loyal maxing aura be enough to protect her cortisol levels from reaching non-optimal levels?
Jared, you're taking full responsibility for these questions.
So, Jared, I'm not sure I have, as a 41-year-old man, sufficient riz to understand what the Sigma is going on here. But, I think one thing you're alluding to here is people's brains being cooked, right? And
that was smooth, man. That was smooth.
Well, there is a brain rot epidemic, right? And Gen Z may be, or Gen Alpha may be, the most blatant, victims of it, with your tung tung sahurs and ballerina cappuccinas and whatever. But boomers are victims of it too. And one of the striking things, as I talked to Clay Parikh, is he said, I get all my news from podcasts. I don't trust anything else. And he was talking about starting his day with Badlands, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. It's just this QAnon thing. And he was like, I watch that every day. And like, yeah, bro, I can tell when you're, going on and on about the cabal and the demonic gay pride poison.
The director of the FBI, in addition to being a big fan of Paramount Plus, Uber Eats, and the New York Islanders, was a fucking podcast. He's a QAnon podcaster.
Well, by the way, let's go Islanders. I'm really excited about Matt Schaefer.
Oh, me too. Oh, you're an Islander fan too?
Yes.
I am too. But I went to one game this year, and it was the game where the Utah Mammoths, or whatever they are, this new team, beat us 7-1 because everybody on the Islanders was hungover from New Year's. And,
I got to see them.
Horrible waste of $200 and whatever dollars I spent to bring my family to that.
I got to see them beat the Pens in overtime earlier this month, so we're gonna have to go out to UBS together because I got a good record so far.
Hit me up. Let's go.
Hell yeah! But what I will say is, Clay Parikh is cooked on these podcasts. And by the way, he's also watching your streaming services and he's taking it as reality. One of the crazier things he said to me was that, he felt NBC's The Blacklist was a quote unquote documentary about the future. And that was something he threw out there as he was trying to explain to me what the cabal is. And again, it's like, if you think the CIA is corrupt, Tulsi Gabbard's their boss, bro. You're working for her. But, he was also saying that one of his idols is Ron Swanson, because he's working in government while he hates it and he also loves meat.
Oh my God.
And it's like, dude, like, Ron Swanson wasn't aspirational, right? Like, you're not getting the joke. But I think that's the
This
thing.
guy,
like,
this guy is very Jared coded. Like, this is the type of guy that Jared is very interested in. He likes
no,
guys like this.
I think I began the conversation, saying this is a type of guy, and I think what Georgia is right now is it's a window into this larger election challenge. And it is a state that, as we've said, has been a key focus for them. It's one where, due to the power they've obtained on the board, they are in a position to do some real damage, but it's not the only one. And, I think my conversation with Clay Parikh, which I really would encourage people to read on TPM, is a window into just how deranged and dangerous this all is. But let's also keep in mind that he didn't comment on a lot. He didn't comment on what else might be next and what else he's working on. And I think when you see these people, and I'm tracking all of them, your Cleta Mitchells, your Liz Harringtons, your Kevin Monclaws, they are very excited right now. They see a fellow traveler in Tulsi Gabbard. I was watching InfoWars, where Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, and who did time for seditious conspiracy for leading those guys to the Capitol on January 6th. He was referring to Tulsi Gabbard as quote unquote blackpilled and the only person he trusts in government. These people are rejoicing, and they are telling us more is coming, and they have obtained real power.
In mentioning the boomers and that and that their brains are also cooked and blah blah blah, it is probably a tragedy that there are many people in this country who are going to die of old age believing stuff that is completely not true and completely insane. That's sad, all right, but that's happened in different ways throughout American history. I guess what I see here, and correct me if I'm wrong, they have this through this, for lack of a better word, disinfo. They have this like a square peg that they're trying to shove into a circular hole, right? In which they're like, this is the reality that I see, and America is a different reality that we live through, and they're just trying to just jam cram it in, and it seems like a race to kind of prevent that from happening, because it won't actually even fit when they get it through. It'll just be some kind of more freakish version of America with authoritarianism, and basically trying to just stop them. Are you aware of the various different methods in which people are trying to stop this? You have folks like Raskin, who make a lot of noise about elections and about this stuff. What are we? Because I remember after January 6th, there was a January 6th committee. I and many of my colleagues wrote various things for them or were interviewed by them, and ultimately there was this theatrical show that went on. There were a few people who were held in contempt, and there were some charges around that. But ultimately what we got was 2024 and Trump. Are there any, what are the tools to kind of stop this effort to jam the fake reality into America as it exists?
One of the things I've just been obsessed with over the past couple of years is, again, that there is this authoritarian movement to essentially, take democracy out of the picture. It does have these militant arms, these propaganda arms, these legal arms and political arms, And I think a big problem after January 6th was you saw consequences for the rioters. You saw consequences for people like Stuart Rhodes, but we did not address the higher level organized elements of the push that brought people into the Capitol that day.
Yeah.
Particularly the political arm. At TPM, we published Mark Meadows' text messages, and they showed how members of Congress were involved in these efforts to overturn the elections, including particularly in Georgia. We have literally an entire story on that. And there was no consequence for any of them. And so I think we're living in the world where something extreme happens, something like that, something that extreme happens, and there are no consequences. And I would contrast that maybe to Brazil and South Korea, where just recently you saw sort of attempts to throw out an election and attempts to seize power or storm the Capitol. And there was a real robust legal and political response ensuring that those people were removed from politics, right? And we're seeing what happens when you don't deal with the problem. right? That being said, I'm not a doomer, right? I'm going to hockey games, man. Like, I'm having fun in my life. And I don't know, right, that this is going to succeed ultimately. I think we need to be honest and real about the fact that we're far down a dark road. I think we need to be honest and real that the intent is potentially for Trump to stay a third term or to disrupt elections so that one of his allies is able to win no matter what. Right. And I say, no matter what, but the reality is his numbers are pretty bad. And I think that's part of why they're flailing so much right now. But I don't know that it's going to succeed. I think first off, I would almost go into the language of recovery, right? The first step to dealing with your problem is admitting you have a problem, right? And right now as a country, like, we're addicted to brain drugs, and we need to admit that we have a problem. But also, what I will say, while maybe I haven't been impressed with the Democrats and the political response to Trump, I think people are really rising up. Right. And at the tail end of last year, I wrote a series on TPM about what we called the undocumented underground. And as much as Trump has this authoritarian movement, what I started to see was that there's this movement confronting Trump and mass deportation that includes a political arm, that includes a legal arm and court observers and people, getting these court orders, pulling people out of ICE detention. Right? We may have these, everyone talks about the masked folks in the streets, but the reality is sometimes when they take people, those people get free because, there are regular people, filing paperwork and going to court on their behalf. And then, this resistance also includes a protest component and an activist component with people observing them in the street, which is, part of the only reason we really know and understand how folks like Alex Preddy and Renee Good died. So people are standing up. And we've seen this rebuffed to some degree in Massachusetts. Massachusetts. We've seen this rebuffed to some degree in Minneapolis. We're also seeing, I think, folks like Mark Elias and people who are really preparing for the legal fights that we're going to need to have around the next elections. So I think people are standing up. I think there is opposition, but that's got to begin with folks realizing just how dangerous it's getting.
So we've been talking to Hunter Walker, investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo. I'll put links to his social profile, some of the stories he's written. Hunter, before we let you go, I've got one more question. I know it's hard to choose, but what's your favorite Kid Rock song?
Oh my. I would say my favorite Kid Rock song is a live cut, a deep cut. And it's his performance at the TPUSA where he struggled to lip sync because
not a lot of people know about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I really did enjoy watching that. And I think as we have this debate of sort of doomerism versus optimism, I think TPUSA's effort to have a halftime show because they were angry about people speaking Spanish is a pretty good thing to point to when it comes to the limits of the right's cultural and actual power, right? That did not have the juice. It didn't even function well. And the reality is, there is an authoritarian movement that is trying to change life as we know it, but sometimes, to paraphrase Donald Trump, they're not sending their best. They're sending Kid Rock.
I like that Nick Fuentes called it the White Cuck Show. At least I had a good laugh at that.